Well, my name is Maureen Murphy, and I'm not going to go into a whole storytelling job, but really over the next half hour or so, mind you, if anybody knows me, I can absolutely talk for Ireland. So I think I probably will need a wave, at least 5 minutes before the end, just to give ourselves time to have a chat and allow you to ask any questions that you might have around storytelling. So a little bit about Orion. I mean, we are a learning and development company, but I, as the MD, am absolutely passionate about stories. I try to squeeze in a story, at least one story, into every piece of learning that we develop for clients. And now sometimes it can take a little bit of persuasion to get away from linear learning. They have to follow every single page, and they have to have a multiple choice assessment at the end, just so that we know they've learnt everything. So building on John's talk a little bit earlier, John and I would work a lot together on sort of brain friendly and how stories build in. I mean, that's absolutely how not to get learning embedded into practice. Because why do we teach, why do we spend all this money on training people? What do we want them to do? Change. If I ever see the word understand, I have to do a little bit of teaching sometimes with the clients about never use the word understand in a learning outcome. What do you want them to do differently? After they take their hands off the keyboard, off their iPad, what do you want them to do? What are the 3 next things you want them to actually do? So we always build in little techniques. So it's all about behavior change, and stories are a great way to do that. Whether it's through storytelling about how to introduce calories into your menu. We do some work with kids. Storytelling for kids is great through core teaching the curriculum through stories. The one up at the top is kind of a MOOC type environment, but it was all about a curation of stories, digital stories, which then building in lots of reflective and work-based activities. A super way to actually learn, going beyond this notion of linear learning. So again, storytelling, I'm gladdened to hear, is getting out there, but it does take a time and crafting as instructional designers, as e-learning developers. It does take a particular skill, I would say, to actually craft good stories for learning. Now, you might say, okay, what do we mean by stories? So we would say, as learning designers, we have a whole toolkit of options available to us to build in stories into our learning interventions, our learning design. Now, some would say there is a progression here, but you might say you have a case study, which is an example of something in practice at a fixed time. I'm happy to share these slides through the website. They'll be on our own website later, or if you want to come down to B80 and get a copy of them, that would be 100%. So you've got case studies which are typically a fixed learning point that can be a very simple, quick way to capture learning at a fixed point in time. We're moving up then, you might have something a little bit more real world. The vignette might be, again, a very short little scenario, but building in action. For any stories in learning, always bring in interactivity, actions, decisions to move the story along, so that you actually are building in a little bit more of an immersive learning feel, so the learner becomes part of the story and ideally can direct the story if we're building in full branching scenarios. Moving up then to our scenarios where you have a little bit more guided learning. Again, could be linear or it could be full branching learning scenarios, which, whilst all the literature says they're fantastic and they are, but they take so long to design. Has anybody done any branching stories? What's your experience? Fun? Do you do it? Yeah? Okay. It is fun. It's a very good intellectual challenge, but actually taking the time to do it and follow down through all permutations and branches can be quite time consuming, and we'll look at a little bit of that later about where you actually draw the line within, say, a branching scenario. Then we're getting into full drama productions, which again, you're really trying to get into the emotional aspects. Again, the best type of stories would have emotion, would have audio, would have music. You're actually really trying to get in. Now, we're not talking about an episode of Coronation Street here. It is short, typical dramas for learning. It takes a little bit more money, a little bit more time, planning, but it can be a very rich learning experience. And then we can get into a different style of learning. And again, there's so many tools now on social media that it's really helping this whole notion of digital storytelling, personal storytelling. That can be part of your learning program. And again, there can be this little bit of a tension between the organizational voice and what you want your learners to actually say in these digital stories, but we'll touch on that. And then you get into the full sort of immersive gaming and VR environments where you're really getting into discovery learning. Again, it can be a little bit more expensive, time-consuming, it needs certain skill sets. But again, we have all these options available to us for building in storytelling into our learning interventions. Now, I added on this whole notion of whiteboard animations or explainer videos. Has anybody ever used those? You know, the little hand-drawing things you see? So powerful. You can tell a story in typically 90 seconds. And again, it really gets our learners into immersing. The big thing about whiteboard animations is there's a lot of gaps in a whiteboard animation. And it's down to the learner to join the dots, but a great way to pack a punch into a story. So that age-old question, why would you bother introducing or use stories for your learning? Memorable? Why are they memorable? Sorry, who said that? It was a fantastic answer. Yes?
Because of the way our brain functions, we can actually remember connecting the dots through a story.
Okay.
And snapshots.
Yes, because we're building in the whole semantic networks of our brain, the cognitive theory, yes. Building on what we know, we're relating it. Oh, I know I can relate to that. Something in my brain, yeah. Any other? It's relatable. Absolutely. And where we're looking for in a really good story, it's relatable and it's realistic. They can see themselves in that story. Yes, because more actively listen because ideally, yeah. And you want to find out what happens to characters, or if you go into full immersive storytelling, how you can direct the action into the story. So you're controlling the learning and you feel that bit more engaged with what you're learning. So again, some of the key points, these were just a little bit, we've got memorable in there, this whole idea of sticky learning. Can become a well-designed story is memorable. Ideally will tug on emotions, particularly when you get into digital storytelling, where you're actually you're tugging, you feel sad, you feel happy, you're actually remembering the emotion which will trigger the learning behind. So again, ideal for certainly within digital stories, that is, it's drawing on our emotions, it's personal, becomes personal to them, it's not talking about just general European legislation, it's how that legislation relates to us in our organisation, how we put those policies, procedures into practice in our local organisation. So it becomes personal for you or for the organisation, ideally realistic, and very often a well-crafted story will help join up the dots. You can see how behaviour relates to documentation, relates to the SOPs, so you can bring all those elements into a good story. And very much going beyond the notion of linear learning, where we're introducing, we've got our learning outcomes, we're introducing a policy, we're introducing an assessment, we teach, test, teach, test, teach, test. We're really trying to open up that learning and getting our learners to explore. Now, we would say a well-scripted story should really focus on behaviours. Again, when we get into scenario-based learning, where we're trying to identify the core behaviours that we want to change through the learning, and you're building your story around it. So crafting your story around the behaviours, as we'll come on to see, that you want to improve, that you want to start, or you want to stop. So again, we would use this idea of a KISS analysis for behaviour change. What are the core behaviours you want to keep and reinforce? Which are the ones you want to improve? Start and stop, and build your stories around that framework. And obviously then, within our storytelling or scenario-based learning, we've got this safe learning environment where you're giving the learner options and they're directing the outcomes. They can see consequences. But again, we would do a lot of work in healthcare. They're not killing anyone in the process. So if they don't prescribe the right medication or prescription, we can see on paper, online, the consequences, but it is within that safe learning environment. So thinking about your own organisation, the types of learning that you develop, because I'm assuming everyone is involved, whether it's in classroom training, or it's online, it's blended, it's distance learning. Where could you use stories in your organisation? Or where have you used stories? Yes?
For example, if you implement a new process and you want people to feel easy about it, to actually, get on with the new process, you can create a story around it with an experienced person who already, went through the process.
Yes.
And another one who just joined maybe the company, and that'll be an easy way for them to grab what's important about the process, why do we have that process, and how do I go along with that.
Okay. So whether it's a new process and you're projecting the would-be behaviours, or you're trying to elicit the experience of an experienced practitioner and they're telling a story around how they put that into practice. Excellent. Any other places where you might use stories? Any other types of learning? A call centre, okay. Yeah.
Complaints management, listening through and putting that on an e-learning.
Okay.
And then they direct it, direct how the call ends.
Right, give me an example of a story. If I say, write me a story. What would you look at? What would you look for first?
What would I look for? I don't know.
Focus on maybe the challenging calls and talk.
Yeah, it'd be a complaints call.
Yeah.
So the customer would be the first person. They would then acknowledge the complaint, but they'll have different scenarios where they can form it. They form the
follow
full
through the
call.
story.
Yeah.
Right the way through the story.
Yeah.
Okay. And maybe complemented by a digital story from someone who's dealt with that and their coping strategies that they've built up over time. Okay.
Yeah, we're from the recruitment industry, so we could literally build a story around when somebody first started to look for a job that was a candidate, right through to getting a job and all the steps in between, actually.
Yeah.
That we could make even modular stories, I would have thought.
Yeah. But again, it's trying to get to the actual, where was the fear? So that candidate actually was clear about where the fear was, where the excitement was. So that the good thing about storytelling is that you go beyond, that it doesn't read like an annual report or something, like an organisational voice, that you actually get into the mindset and you're capturing the feelings, the emotions of the candidate, rather than the ideal world, the steps of the SOP.
Consultant.
Yeah, and the consultant, absolutely. So these are just a couple of examples of where we would have used them. Induction, actually getting new starts to talk about how they felt. And again, the beauty of doing the likes of digital stories, or the balance that you have to get is the balance between giving them freedom of what they really felt without being too negative, maybe about the organisation. So again, there's that whole balance of storytelling, of where and how much the organisational voice comes in. But new starts talking about their stories of how they got inducted. Succession planning. A great way before someone leaves, maybe they've been in the organisation, all that tacit knowledge, the quickest way is to sit down and just get them to tell a story about all those difficult tasks, all those difficult customers that they've dealt with. A great way to capture experience before someone leaves the organisation. Storytelling for marketing capturing the stories from customers and sharing those stories with new starts, or there's quality improvement initiatives. Actually go out and interview your customers, capture those stories and build it into your training program. Our lessons learned. We would do a lot of storytelling around training and product simulations. So rather than, for example, going, okay, step 1, log in, click the left-hand button, do X, Y, and Z, click submit. What we have found is a much richer way to actually do, say, product simulations or for training systems, is that you build it around a complete story. So the story, you've got a case file, and you have to figure out how to use the system, so you deep dive them into the system following through a particular story. But when you're designing stories, what are some of the things that you need to consider, do you think? So when you were doing your branching scenario, your branching story, what were the things that you had to consider? And were you a subject matter expert? Okay. 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 Yeah, so trying not to get it overcomplicated and making it realistic were some of the challenges that you really had to think of. Anything else that you can think of that you would need to consider? Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That was the culture and the tone. So you're thinking about, will this a storytelling approach work?
Yes, I think when you bring in a storytelling activity into any kind of learning design, and you ask people to tell their story, I think you have to sort of set the expectations of what they're then going to tell you. And obviously in the workplace, it's all appropriate, and they're sharing in a workplace environment. But yeah, I think you do have to, and it's the culture of the organisation. Sometimes they don't want to bring out all of the stories necessarily.
Yes, they would really love to share, or they would tell someone privately.
Yes, yeah, so
absolutely.
Yeah.
So you're right, there's a number of things, certainly when we're looking at the storytelling and deciding what is the best storytelling approach to take, we would look at, okay, well, how much time have we got to develop this learning module? And how many stories do we need to tell to get the learning across? Because whilst it is fun, you get into complex storytelling, it takes time and it takes a level of creativity. And not every instructional designer, as I've found for my instructional designer team, can actually script stories. Some of them are very good at compliance-based learning, the standard stuff, but some others, even on my team, find it really difficult to write dialogue, to make it really realistic. So, I mean, we're doing a program at the minute for a university. So we're writing an equality and diversity program for 18-year-olds. And trying to get dialogue that sounds like an 18-year-old is tough. And they laughed at our dialogue when we showed it to them, the story. Like, no 18-year-old would say trendy bar. Where we had written all this story around going to a trendy bar. So you have to be really be cognizant of the language that you're using. So other things that we would find as well, around storytelling, I don't know whether you find it, but when we work with clients, there's a lot of subject matter experts in the room who just know everything about the subject, but have not potentially practiced. So we might have, say in the medical field, we have got senior managers writing the content, but have not been on the ward for years. So they find it really challenging to actually write a practical story, scenario that relates to what's happening on the ward. And really, if you're doing storytelling, you're more interested in having practitioners than subject experts on your team helping you write that story or that scenario. And again, it takes a level of creativity to write a story and follow it through and get dialogue and make it realistic. One of the key things we find is there has to be real clarity on the core teaching points. we find that a lot of storytelling, people try to put in too much, and then it becomes so complicated that the learner can't navigate their way through it. So a very clear definition of behaviours, and when we are doing personal digital storytelling, making sure that you've got senior management team buy-in. I mean, we did a particular storytelling project. Now, again, it was for an induction program. Now, we thought we had cracking stories. But they went up to the senior management team, and someone, in one of the stories, they didn't like the tone, and that was stopped. And it was a really powerful, personal story about that person as a woman in the organisation. And it was like, oh no, we can't let that, if anybody saw that in the papers, you know, we would be crucified. But it was reality. So getting that senior management buy-in, and certainly with the technical infrastructure, if you're going to do rich storytelling, you might have audio, video, just make sure you can actually run the stories within your technical environment. So what I'm going to show you then is a couple of different types of storytelling. And again, for you to think about what would be the right type of stories for our organisation, for our content, for our audience, for our budget. Do we have the tools to write branching scenarios? I mean, there are tools. Anybody use a tool for storytelling? Like Twine's a good tool for scripting. Anybody use? How did you build your scenarios? Yeah? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. No, nothing too fancy. And the beauty then is to know what your limitations are in your tool and write your stories accordingly. Because very often we want a full branching, and there's 4 options at every key point stage, which means that you've got 4 branches to go, and then suddenly you've got a build time that is 15 times what your budget is, even just to build one scenario. So this was a particular scenario for the healthcare setting. Now, we didn't have much budget, so we couldn't go in video, and we couldn't get patient consent. So it's a very simple little structure, and it is a model, and I'll just show you the structure a little bit later on, to allow us to script and build scenario-based stories very, very quickly. So what this project started out, it was a new guideline document. So they said, could you put that guideline document, put it into an e-learning program for us and give us 20 MCQs at the end? And we thought, okay, that's great, but that's not going to teach anybody anything. So we came up with a whole series of scenarios about how to put that guideline. It's not early warning scores. It's when you go into hospital, you get a certain set of data. So we designed a series of simple little scenarios to put that learning into practice. Now, fingers crossed.
These are the characters who will help the patient in this case study. Click Next to meet the patient. John Murphy is the patient in this case study. He is a 74-year-old male admitted to the hospital 2 days ago with pneumonia. And then click Next to start.
So what we were simulating is a particular case study. Nurses, when they're actually carrying out an activity, have a whole series of documents available to them. So again, we're making those available, trying to make it as realistic as possible. So you've got a toolbox of little resources.
Lisa is a registered nurse who works on a medical ward. She is on her rounds at night when she notices one of her patients' breathing is laboured.
So we're starting through a whole progressive story of the character, and the character deteriorates, and it depends. You have to choose what type of medication to give. But you can see this is done in storyline. Anybody know? You can spot storyline at 20 paces. But again, at every stage, we're setting the scene and we're giving a dilemma or a question, and the learner is directing the care. And we're giving actions and consequences as they go through. So that's a very simple style of scenarios. Then you get into interactive drama. I tell you, I could talk all day about this, guys. So an interactive drama. Now this was done, we really wanted to show the nuances of behaviours, attitudes, language. So we used an interactive drama approach here, built a story around.
Here are the people that need your help. It's the end of the day, and Joe, the hospital porter, has finished his shift. Today was an unusual day. Joe witnessed something happening that wouldn't happen every day. Watch the video to find out what Joe saw.
I was working at reception. It was about 10 a.m. this morning, and I was approached by Mark Smith. He's a national manager with the HSE, and he came up to the desk.
Now these were actors, but really just trying to write really realistic dialogue, and the best and quickest way to pack a lot of punch, where we were using a reflection on a day, and then it reworked the day, and the learner then had to work their way through the scenario. A very simple and very quick way. We shot that video, that whole scenario, it's about 10 minutes, in 3/4 of a day. Now, it took a bit of scripting for the dialogue, but again, really working very hard to get realistic storytelling. So important to have our decision points and consequences as we go through. Now, this is a different type of storytelling. This is our digital stories.
The first time I visited a college was when I was a mature student, and it was awful. I was so anxious and nervous, and I remember feeling, no, how am I going to get through this course? I was a mature student, so obviously I was going into a classroom full of younger people who were chatting in the background.
So what we did there was a new piece of guideline document for colleges. This was in Northern Ireland, through RNIB and a few other organisations. There's a new guideline document to help banks and colleges rework their layout. Now, it was all floor plans and all information, but what we thought the best way to actually get this message home for banks to spend the money is that they have to hear from people who are deaf and blind about what they need to think about. So we recorded a whole series of personal stories. Now, it's a wee bit MOOC-like, but again, it was the combination of personal stories, some key points, and lots of work-based learning activities. And that has been a really powerful, very simple, easy to produce learning resource that has been used, and we've had fantastic feedback from the banks and the colleges of how they've been able to put that learning into practice. The combination of personal stories with work-based learning activities. And they use it online, but they also use it in lunch and learn sessions as well. Now this one is slightly different.
This topic will take you through a case study and then give you an opportunity to complete your own record. The case study is about Mary Kate, one of my clients, who was referred to me by her neighbours and brother. Click next to go through these screens to meet Mary Kate and see how I completed the nursing assessment. Play the video to meet Mary Kate. You will see the breadth of information I found out about her on the initial visit, so that I could identify her care needs and plan individualised care.
So we built an entire story around how to complete a form. We found that nurses didn't know how to complete the form. So we built an entire story around it, and we had a patient story into it. We had a product simulation. They got to try filling out the form. They got feedback. So it was combining good learning theory around our storytelling approach. Now, in the last couple of minutes, I know you need to wrap up, sorry. We have developed over time a set of templates, so we have learned through bitter practice how to actually speed up the development of scenarios. So the first thing we do, and again, we would have some materials around this, I say, if you want to come and see us in B80 First thing we do when we're crafting a good scenario or story is identify the core behaviours. We agree the learning model, we script it, and then we build it, which seems it's very simple outline process. Now, as I say, the first thing for any good story, particularly if you want to look at core behaviour change, is the simplest way that we do. We use our KISS. We look at the behaviours you want to keep, improve, start, and step up, or stop. That was a typo there. I was trying to hide that. You see, now, if that was any of my team would do that, I would go through them with a shortcut. So we use our KISS model for identify the behaviours. Now, you can go into a full... Now, when we've more time, we do a full Cathy Moore action mapping, where we look at the key skills, we look at the learning environment, and you're building in the learning environment into your storytelling. You look at the underpinning knowledge. So you look at how they get, where that information is accessible to them in the workplace, and if they don't need to memorize it, we make it available to them in the story. And again, we look at the motivation factors. What's in it for me, and why would they even bother actually undertaking this behaviour change? And you build all those factors into your story. Now again, this was just one example of a set of micro behaviours as an example of a matrix that we developed. We looked at all our core characters, all our micro behaviours, and we built our stories around it. So there is a little bit of crafting around writing a good, fulsome story. And then the next thing you have to decide, particularly when you're doing scenario-based learning, is the model. Now, this is probably the simplest type of model that we would use for scenario design. You're setting the scene, you meet the characters, you take the first action point. Now, if you wanted to get into full branching, you could actually look at if they pick an incompetent or risky. So very often, for every decision point, we have the right one, we have a risky answer, and we have an incompetent answer. Now, you can decide the simplest way. If you want to follow the happy path and reinforce good behaviour, let them only follow the happy path down the competent choice, but give them the consequences for selecting the risky or incompetent answer. Now, this is absolutely the quickest way to write a good happy path scenario, building in learning for every step. Now, Cathy Moore might say you just throw them in and let them do all the poor steps. But what we find for learning is you have to give them supporting learning at every step. So again, following the steps through, typically we find 3 action points or dilemma is fine until you get to the full outcome. And another thing that we have learned when writing scripts, give your team a template. So we have developed a very simple template, and again, I'm very happy to share this with you, using this model, where you give them instructions on how to write a backstory, what you need for your characters, how you write your dilemmas. Otherwise, we have found it can take weeks to write a good story. You give your SMEs, your practitioners, this template, we can get it written in a day, in an afternoon's workshop. Digital stories is a little bit needs a slightly different approach. We have a whole series of templates. We have a storytelling tool available called Story, and there's a whole series of templates that you can access on Tell My Story. Again, mind mapping and scripting. And again, if you go onto that particular tool, it'll give you some guidance there. But just to wrap up then, 5 tips for using stories. Try to keep them as absolutely realistic as possible. You need a practitioner to be at your side to making sure the stories ring true. Focus on your behaviours that you want to develop and introduce action points right the way throughout your story so that the learner feels engaged. And try not to overcomplicate. We normally say 3 decision points in a scenario is sufficient to get your learning message across. And stories can be used everywhere within your organisation. So have your storytelling antenna up at all times and look for opportunities for stories. So hopefully we've met the outcomes as published in the agenda today. But anybody, any questions? No? Okay. Sure, if anybody has any questions, I'll be down at B80 if you want to ask anything or get access to any of the templates for storytelling. All right, thanks a lot.